for most of the men aboard the ships that morning. The Atlantic looked calm enough to trust. The convoys stretched across the gray water in long, disciplined columns, merchant vessels moving steadily in formation while destroyers and corvettes traced protective circles around them. Above it all, patrol aircraft cut wide arcs through the cold sky, their engines humming with a steady reassurance that danger would be seen long before it could strike. Convoys like this had crossed the ocean many times before. Procedures were refined, escorts were experienced, and intelligence reports suggested that the route ahead held little immediate threat. Yet somewhere in the wide sky above that convoy, one pilot felt a quiet sense that something about the scene below did not fit the confidence everyone else seemed to share. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, a dull metallic surface broken only by the long wakes trailing behind the convoy's ships. Each vessel held its place with careful precision, the formation shaped through months of hard-learned experience. Tankers rode low in the water with their valuable cargo. Freighters carried ammunition and machinery bound for distant ports, and smaller cargo ships followed close behind. On the edges of the formation, naval escorts remained alert but calm, their crews accustomed to the constant rhythm of convoy duty. Lookouts scanned the horizon through Salt Street binoculars, while sonar operators below decks listened to the deep quiet of the sea. The pilot circling above them belonged to the convoy's rotating air patrol, a routine assignment that often passed without incident. His aircraft moved through a familiar pattern designed to keep the convoy under watch from every direction. The flight plan had been calculated carefully, ensuring that no approach path remained uncovered for long. 4 hours at a time, the patrols followed their designated routes while the convoy pressed forward at a steady pace. Most days, the sky patrols saw little more than empty ocean, but routine can make certain details fade into background, and this pilot had learned during earlier patrols that the ocean often whispered its warnings quietly. Small disturbances could reveal what the eye alone struggled to notice. A faint change in the water's texture, a line in the waves that did not belong. Even the pattern of a ship's wake could sometimes hint at something moving far beneath the surface. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The convoy moved smoothly, its escort vessels shifting positions with a quiet efficiency that came from long practice. Radio chatter remained minimal, limited to occasional updates and navigational checks. The sky held only thin clouds drifting across pale light. Yet as a patrol aircraft completed another slow turnover formation, the pilot found his attention drifting away from the ships themselves and toward the water beyond them. It was a subtle observation, something easily dismissed if one was not looking closely. Several miles from the convoy's outer edge, the water appeared to carry a disturbance that did not follow the natural rhythm of wind or current. The shape was faint, barely visible even from altitude, but it stretched across the surface in a narrow line that seemed almost deliberate. At first glance, it might have been a fading trace of an earlier wave pattern or a patch of shifting current. Still, the pilot kept watching. He adjusted his aircraft slightly, altering the angle of his patrol just enough to pass over the area again. From above, the ocean revealed itself slowly, details emerging only when light struck the surface at the right angle. The aircraft's engine droned steadily as he circled back, the convoy shrinking behind him while he studied the distant patch of water. Nothing dramatic appeared. No obvious silhouette, no rising plume, no unmistakable sign of danger. Yet the disturbance remained faintly visible, a thin irregularity in an otherwise uniform surface. It seemed to drift slowly, maintaining a direction that felt purposeful rather than random. Experience had taught many patrol pilots that submarines often revealed themselves in small waves long before they could be seen clearly. When running just below the surface, a submerged vessel could disturb the water enough to leave a faint wake behind it. The effect was subtle and easy to miss, especially when observers expected the ocean to remain empty. The pilot allowed his aircraft to continue forward while he weighed the possibility quietly. Submarine activity had declined in this sector over recent weeks, according to briefings given before departure. Escorts believed the region relatively safe compared to the more heavily contested lanes further north. That confidence had shaped the convoy's chosen route. Yet the Atlantic had a long memory for surprises. From his vantage point, the convoy now stretched far behind him, its ships appearing as small gray shapes cutting narrow trails through the sea. The patrol pattern expected him to maintain distance and continue scanning outward, trusting the escorts below to handle anything detected within closer range. Protocol relied on coordination, discipline, and strict adherence to establish flight paths. Still, the ocean below continued to hold that strange disturbance. The pilot leaned slightly forward in his seat, studying the surface with quiet concentration as the aircraft passed overhead once more. The shape in the water had shifted slightly since his last pass, maintaining a slow movement that followed a direction leading almost directly toward the convoy's projected path. He said nothing over the radio yet. Observations alone were not enough to justify concern, and breaking routine for a vague impression could easily draw unnecessary attention from command. Convoy operations depended on maintaining order across many moving parts. But as the aircraft completed another gradual turn and the faint wake appeared once again beneath him, the pilot felt a growing certainty that the calm surface below might be concealing something far more deliberate than drifting water. The patrol aircraft resumed its assigned arc as if nothing unusual had been seen, the pilot guiding the machine back toward the invisible grid that organized the sky above the convoy. Procedures governed every movement in these operations. Each aircraft was given a defined sector, a predictable loop to the air that overlapped with others just enough to create an unbroken shield of observation. From the perspective of those planning the convoy's defense, discipline in the air was as important as the guns and sonar carried by the escort ships below. When pilots followed their routes precisely, the ocean around the convoy remained under constant watch. Below him, the convoy continued its steady progress across the Atlantic, unaware that its calm routine had begun to attract a second layer of scrutiny. The merchant ships moved like patient animals through cold water, their wakes spreading in long white trails that slowly faded behind them. Destroyers and smaller escort vessels maintained a vigilant perimeter, their crews scanning horizons that revealed nothing but open sea. Inside their command centers, officers monitored reports arriving from patrol aircraft and surface lookouts, confirming again and again that no immediate threat had been detected. For most involved in the operation, the patrol system itself represented reassurance. Convoys had crossed these waters many times before, and each successful journey reinforced the belief that the system worked. Escorts followed established spacing. Aircraft flew their assigned sectors. Intelligence briefings, drawn from weeks of intercepted signals and reconnaissance reports, suggested that enemy submarine groups were operating elsewhere. Yet from the cockpit of the circling aircraft, that certainty felt increasingly fragile. The pilot allowed the patrol pattern to carry him along its wide path while his eyes continued to return to the distant patch of ocean he had noticed earlier. The disturbance itself had not vanished, but it had shifted position, drifting slightly closer to the route the convoy would soon follow. At first, the change appeared small enough to ignore. Ocean surfaces constantly changed, pushed by wind and hidden currents. Many such irregularities dissolved when observed from a different angle, but this one remained. The aircraft banked gently as the patrol arc curved back toward the convoy's outer edge. From that vantage point, the pilot could see the full scale of the formation again. The ships arranged in careful rows that stretched across miles of water. Their spacing had been designed with precision, close enough to concentrate defensive fire, far enough apart to reduce the risk of multiple ships being struck by a single torpedo spread. Even from altitude, the pattern held a quiet sense of order. Yet the pilot noticed something else as he studied the formation's edges. The water beyond the convoy's path seemed marked by additional disturbances, faint, narrow lines in the surface that appeared and vanished depending on the angle of the sunlight. At first, he wondered whether they might simply be the fading trails of earlier patrol craft or the lingering wake of distant merchant traffic. Still, the more he looked, the more those lines began to form a pattern. They did not follow the direction of the wind. They did not drift aimlessly as natural currents would. Instead, they seemed arranged in a loose alignment ahead of the convoy's projected course, spaced in a way that felt deliberate even if no clear shapes could yet be seen beneath the surface. The pilot had encountered something similar before, during earlier patrols over contested waters. Submarines operating together often moved in coordinated lines beneath the surface, maintaining positions that allowed them to intercept convoys as they approached. When several vessels maneuvered slowly at shallow depth, Their movement could disturb the water just enough to create faint wakes that lingered briefly before dissolving. It was never an obvious signal. From higher altitude, the ocean concealed such signs easily, but at the right height, with the right light across the water, the disturbances could sometimes betray the presence of machines hidden far below. The pilot adjusted his course slightly again, careful not to deviate enough to trigger immediate questions over the radio. Officially, he remained within his assigned patrol corridor. Unofficially, he had begun to study the ocean with increasing focus, tracing the direction of each faint line he could detect. One wake seemed to drift slowly northward. Another angled gently toward the convoy's path. Individually, none of them proved anything, but together they began to suggest a shape forming beneath the calm water, a configuration that looked uncomfortably like the outer edge of an intercept line. Behind him, the convoy pressed forward with the same steady confidence it had held all morning. Inside the escort ships, sonar operators continued to listen to the deep quiet of the sea. Their equipment could detect propellers or machinery moving through the water, but only if the submarines drew close enough to fall within range. Beyond that invisible boundary, the ocean remained silent. Submarine commanders understood this advantage well. When operating far enough from the escorts, they could maneuver into position long before the convoy realized it had been discovered. The pilot felt a growing weight in his thoughts as the pieces of the scene began to settle into place. If the disturbances he was observing truly marked the movements of submerged vessels, then they were not scattered randomly. They were aligning themselves across the convoy's path, slowly forming a barrier that the merchant ships would soon approach. That realization carried consequences. If enemy submarines had indeed moved into such positions, they were likely waiting for darkness or for the convoy to close the distance enough for a coordinated strike. The attack would not come from a single direction, but from several, forcing the escorts to divide their attention while torpedoes spread to the vulnerable merchant columns. Convoys had survived such encounters before, but only through rapid detection and immediate response. From where he flew, the pilot understood that detection might already be late. He glanced again toward the convoy behind him. From this distance, it appeared peaceful, its ships advancing in patient rows across water that revealed nothing of what might lie ahead. The escort aircraft around him continued their patrol loops exactly as planned, unaware of the growing patterns slowly emerging beneath the sea's surface. Protocol expected him to maintain his route, report only confirmed sightings, and allow the convoy's defensive system to operate as designed. Yet the ocean below was beginning to tell a different story, one that grew harder to ignore with each passing minute. The aircraft continued along its patrol arc for several more minutes, but the pilot's focus had already drifted far beyond the invisible boundaries of the assigned grid. Beneath the wings, the ocean stretched outward in cold gray silence, interrupted only by the fading wakes he had begun to notice earlier. Each time the plane circled back, those faint disturbances appeared again, shifting slightly but never disappearing entirely. What at first seemed like an isolated irregularity now looked increasingly like movement organized with intent. Convoy patrol doctrine left little room for interpretation. Pilots were trained to follow their sectors exactly, overlapping with neighboring aircraft, so that every portion of the surrounding sea remained under observation. When one aircraft deviated, even briefly, the system weakened. Gaps formed in the pattern, leaving corridors through which unseen threats might approach. Discipline in the air was therefore enforced as strictly as any order aboard the ships below. The pilot understood that better than anyone. Yet as he studied the surface once more, the growing pattern beneath the water refused to settle into harmless explanation. Several thin wakes appeared to run roughly parallel with one another, each separated by a distance that felt too deliberate to belong to natural currents. Even the direction of their movement suggested coordination, slowly drifting toward the convoy's projected route, like a line tightening across its path. He had seen such formations described in intelligence briefings before departure. Submarine groups often attempted to form intercept lines when they believed a convoy was approaching. Individual boats positioned themselves several miles apart, each commander waiting quietly for the moment when the merchant columns would move into range. When that happened, the submarines could attack simultaneously from multiple directions, overwhelming escorts that suddenly faced threats from every side. From high altitude, that trap remained almost invisible, The pilot looked again toward the convoy behind him. Its ships continued forward with steady determination, unaware that the calm water ahead might already be occupied. Escort vessels maintained their watch, their crews confident that aircraft patrols extended far enough to reveal danger early. But the patrol grid was built on a fragile assumption that threats would reveal themselves clearly enough to justify immediate action. What lay below the surface now seemed determined not to reveal itself at all. For a moment, the pilot allowed his aircraft to continue forward as if nothing had changed. The patrol corridor curved gently away from the disturbances he had been studying, guiding him back toward open ocean where nothing unusual could be seen. If he followed the route exactly, another aircraft would soon enter the area he was leaving, repeating the same broad scan from a slightly different angle. Perhaps that pilot would notice the same irregularities. Perhaps he would not. The uncertainty lingered in the pilot's thoughts as the seconds passed. From his position in the cockpit, the faint lines in the water seemed clearer than ever, the angle of the light now revealing several disturbances spaced across the sea in quiet alignment. They were not drifting randomly. They were waiting. The decision came gradually, though its consequences were immediate. He turned the aircraft. The change in direction was small at first, almost subtle enough to appear like a normal adjustment within the patrol pattern. But instead of following the arc that would carry him back across his assigned sector, the pilot guided the plane toward the area where the disturbances appeared most concentrated. The convoy's formation shifted behind him as the aircraft accelerated slightly, closing the distance between sky and suspicion. Breaking formation was not an action taken lightly. Patrol aircraft relied heavily on coordination with one another and with the escorts below. A sudden deviation raised questions quickly, and radios were rarely silent for long when patrol route changed unexpectedly. Within moments, the first inquiry came through the headset, calm but direct. The pilot acknowledged the transmission without offering immediate explanation. From his perspective, confirmation still mattered. He needed to see something undeniable before declaring a submarine presence that could send the entire convoy into defensive maneuver. The aircraft descended gradually, reducing altitude until the ocean surface filled more of the windscreen. Details sharpened as the distance closed. The water no longer appeared as a flat sheet of gray, but as a textured surface, shifting with wind and current. In that closer view, the disturbances became clearer. A long, narrow wake stretched across the sea, faint but unmistakable once seen at the proper angle. It cut through the water with a smooth, deliberate line that held steady despite the surrounding waves. Nearby, another similar trace moved in parallel, its direction converging slowly with first. The pilot leaned forward slightly, studying the water below as the aircraft passed overhead. Even without seeing the vessel itself, the shape of the disturbance revealed something large moving just beneath the surface. The wake possessed mechanical quality, too consistent, too purposeful to belong to anything natural. He circled back immediately, banking the aircraft sharply enough that the horizon tilted across the cockpit windows. The convoy now lay further behind, but its course would bring it directly toward the area he was observing. On the second pass, the ocean revealed more. Another wake appeared further south, almost identical to the others, and then another beyond that, each separated by several miles, but arranged in a loose arc across the water. The space in between them looked deliberate, as though each vessel beneath the surface had been assigned its own portion of sea to guard. From above, the pattern formed a quiet but unmistakable barrier. The pilot transmitted his observation. At first, the response carried skepticism. Patrol routes existed for a reason, and breaking formation without confirmed contact invited concern from those responsible for maintaining the convoy's defensive structure. Commanders aboard the escort vessels needed more than suspicion before altering their operations. But as the pilot continued circling the area, his descriptions grew more precise. Bearings were given, distances measured. The locations of each disturbance were reported carefully. Within minutes, the tone of the radio traffic began to change. Destroyers along the convoy's outer screen altered their heading slightly, moving closer to the coordinates being transmitted from above. Sonar operators prepared their equipment, aware that if submarines truly waited ahead, the convoy might soon pass within detection range. From the aircraft's vantage point, the pilot could now see the full alignment clearly. Several submarines had maneuvered into position across the convoy's path, their shallow movements leaving faint wakes that betrayed the ambush only to someone watching from the sky. The trap had been set quietly beneath the surface, but now it had been seen. The first escort ships began altering course within minutes of the pilot's report. Their movement subtle at first, but purposeful enough to change the geometry of the convoy's defense. Destroyers that had previously traced slow circles along the outer perimeter now pushed outward toward the coordinates being transmitted from the aircraft overhead. On their bridges, officers studied charts while listening carefully to the pilot's continuing observations. The ocean ahead, once treated as empty space, had suddenly become an area of intense interest. From above, the pilot could see the reaction spreading through formation like a quiet signal passing between ships. Wakes shifted as escort vessels accelerated. Merchant captains received new instructions over radio, tightening the spacing between columns while maintaining steady speed. The convoy did not panic or scatter. Years of experience had taught crews that survival depended on maintaining order even when danger appeared. Still, the calm routine of the morning had vanished. The aircraft remained low enough now that the faint disturbances in the water were visible almost continuously. The submarine wakes still traced their narrow lines across the surface, but the pattern had begun to change slightly. What had once been a quiet alignment waiting patiently ahead of the convoy was now showing subtle signs of adjustment. The hidden vessels beneath the sea had likely detected something unusual as well. The approach of escort ships and the repeated passes of the aircraft overhead would not go unnoticed forever. On the leading destroyer, sonar operators leaned close to their equipment as the ship approached the reported positions. Their headphones carried the soft language of the ocean, distant echoes, shifting currents, and the occasional mechanical rhythm that might reveal a submerged engine. At first, the soundscape remained quiet, as it often did when submarines stayed at shallow depth and moved slowly. Then one of the operators heard it. The signal was faint but unmistakable, a metallic pulse repeating at steady intervals somewhere beneath the water ahead. Bearings were calculated quickly, and within moments the destroyer's bridge received confirmation that something large was moving below the surface along the exact line the pilot had described. The destroyer turned sharply toward the contact. From the aircraft above, the maneuver appeared almost sudden. The ship's bow cut across the water with new urgency, its wake widening as engines pushed harder against the sea. Crew members moved quickly along the deck, preparing equipment that had remained idle during the convoy's earlier calm passage. The first depth charges entered the water not long after. From altitude, their detonation appeared as violent eruptions beneath the surface, white plumes of water rising briefly before collapsing back into the gray ocean. The explosions rolled outward through the sea, sending pressure waves deep into the hidden world below. For the submarines waiting in their carefully arranged ambush positions, the effect was immediate. What had been a silent line of patient hunters suddenly faced aggressive resistance. Escort ships converged from multiple directions while the aircraft above continued marking the positions of any remaining disturbances. Additional patrol planes altered their routes as well, drawn toward the growing confrontation unfolding ahead of the convoy. The ocean that had appeared empty only minutes earlier now held the unmistakable signs of conflict. More depth charges followed. Destroyers and corvettes moved through the area in deliberate patterns, releasing their explosives in sequences designed to disrupt any submarine attempting to hold position beneath the convoy's path. Each detonation shook the water violently, forcing the hidden vessels to choose between enduring the assault or diving deeper and abandoning their carefully prepared alignment. The submarines had lost their advantage. Without the element of surprise, the coordinated strike they had planned became far more difficult to execute. Torpedo attacks required positioning and patience, both of which were slipping away as escorts filled the area with noise and pressure waves. Beneath the surface, commanders now faced a different calculation. Remaining in place risked severe damage or destruction. Attempting to continue the ambush meant operating inside a tightening defensive net. One by one, the faint wakes that had marked their positions began to fade. From the air, the pilot noticed the change first. The narrow lines that had once moved steadily toward the convoy's course now broke apart or vanished entirely. Some submarines had likely dived deeper, leaving the surface calm again. Others had already turned away, retreating into darker water, where detection would become far more difficult. The trap was dissolving before it could fully close. Escort vessels remained cautious, continuing their search patterns long after the first explosions had echoed across the sea. Sonar teams listened for further movement, while aircraft maintained low patrols above the area. Yet as the convoy advanced closer to the former intercept line, it became increasingly clear that the submarines had lost their opportunity. The merchant ships passed through the region hours later, with little sign of the confrontation that had nearly awaited them. Their wakes crossed the same water where submarines had once waited silently, now leaving only the fading disturbances created by escort vessels and detonating charges. Life aboard the convoy gradually returned to its earlier rhythm. Engines droned steadily. Lookouts continued their patient scans across the horizon. But among the escort crews, the mood had shifted in subtle ways. Reports circulated quietly between ships describing how close the submarines had come to establishing their ambush line. Without the pilot's early observation, the convoy might have sailed directly into that formation. In the sky above, the aircraft that had first spotted the disturbances eventually returned to its broader patrol pattern. The pilot now followed instructions more closely, his deviation from formation no longer a matter of concern. What had once seemed like a breach of discipline had instead revealed a danger that routine procedures had not yet detected. Later assessments would examine the encounter carefully. Naval officers studied the pilot's reports alongside sonar records and the movements of the escort vessels that responded first. The conclusion reached quietly across several command briefings was simple. The convoy had come dangerously close to entering a coordinated submarine attack. Instead, the ambush had been broken apart before it could begin. The ships continued their long journey across the Atlantic, their formation holding steady as they moved towards safer waters. Few of the merchant sailors fully understood how narrowly disaster had been avoided that day. For them, the convoy had simply encountered a brief moment of tension before pressing onward again. But within the patrol squadrons and escort crews who had witnessed the event unfold, the memory remained clearer. A single aircraft had noticed what others had missed, and for the convoy moving patiently across the cold ocean, that quiet moment of attention had made all the difference.